Ladies and gentlemen, this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing the third and final part of my thoughts and opinions on cloud-based technology. This one will be wrapping it up by giving my final thoughts and conclusions and giving a balanced point of view rather than the previous two videos, which of course have been heavily biased. The first giving a lot of the negatives of the cloud, the second focusing on the positives. I'm going to be releasing another video which has got nothing to do with this series on cloud, but this one is going to be focused on exactly how it works. I've already released one video on it which gives a rough explanation, but the next is going to be going a lot more in depth and showing you guys how to actually set up your own virtual machines and much more besides, so it's going to be pretty cool. Anyway, I'm going to of course assume that you guys have watched parts 1 and 2 and have a reasonable knowledge by now of cloud-based technologies before we progress. So, we've spoken heavily about the pros and the cons, and we've also spoken about what some developers have said as well. But I think before we go any further, I think there are a couple of things we need to clear up. Firstly, some stuff is just inevitable. We've spoken somewhat about this previously, but I think it's good just to recover it. The first is that, you know what, it's inevitable that some pieces of cloud technology are going to become more and more part of our lives. We're going to be seeing much more instances of dedicated servers, many more instances of dedicated servers, shall I say. Similarly, we're also going to be seeing many more instances of CDNs. We're going to be content delivery networks. We're also going to be seeing many more instances of where developers start pushing towards, for example, digital distribution, which is all done, of course, via the cloud. Just yesterday, for example, I reported on a piece of news where both Sony and Microsoft's machine was capable of automatically downloading a purchase you've made if you weren't at the machine. So let's assume, for example, you're at work, you are sitting there at your desk, you see, oh okay, there's a new game coming out, it's a flash deal, it's going to be available for the next, 8 hours, I'm at work, I won't get back in time, I'm going to just buy it on my smartphone. So you do that. And then the purchase is basically not just bought, it's also waiting for you. Now this is kind of similar to what you can do on Steam. You can actually get an app on your smartphone, for example your Android. You can download that app, you can buy whichever game you want. And when you get home, the game's already in your library. However, you have to manually download it because the PC doesn't have low power state, unlike a console. Or should I say, the next generation of consoles. So I think stuff like this is just going to be normal now. We're going to be getting much more in-depth networks and much more connected. And I don't necessarily mind that. I'm actually pretty happy with it. Of course, we've also heard of developers giving their own thoughts and weigh-ins of cloud-based technology. This is everything down from AI all the way to things such as physics. And without a question, a lot of people automatically associate this with the Xbox One. It's not. We've already gone over some of this before, but it's not really been part of this series, so I'm just going to quickly add it in. But the developers behind Titanfall, Respawn, have actually already stated that, look, in theory at least, they could actually have the same server binary hosting multiple platforms. In fact, I'm going to read you guys out a section of the quote. Technically, if we worked really hard, we could have the same server binary for all platforms. I don't think that's going to happen, as it doesn't really matter. It'll just spin up 100,000 PC servers or 200,000 Xbox One servers, end quote. And this is going to be pretty similar to what we're going to be seeing in the future, obviously. Both platforms, I'm talking about the consoles here versus the PC, so PS4 and Xbox One I'm going to lump into one whole for a moment, versus the PC are very similar. They have many similarities. There are some discrepancies, of course, between them. It's not like you can just say, well, this is like programming for a PC. There are definite differences, but there are a lot more similarities than what there ever have been. The Xbox One, the original Xbox, shall I say, which of course was released way back when, had some similarities as well. Remember, it was put together actually by a development team who were using quite literally parts from Dell laptops. That's what the story is anyway. They had a bunch of old Dell laptops they bought in, and they quite literally dismantled the laptops and they tinkered them together, and that's how the parts for the original Xbox came together. And it was, of course, using like a derivative of a Pentium 3/Celeron processor, a GeForce graphics card, and various other bits and bobs as well for the original Xbox. Respawn Interactive are going very whole hog on the cloud-based technologies. They are going to be adding in AI and physics. Meanwhile, DICE, who are of course responsible for the game's Battlefield, have said that they like some of the ideas of cloud technology. They do, specifically involving artificial intelligence, but they're not too keen to implement it yet on multiplayer titles. One area that a lot of developers could start agreeing on is what is known as dedicated servers. Dedicated servers are pretty obvious concepts. They are proper servers. They are not instances where you are, for example, the host on your local machine. There are a couple of issues I have with this. I've spoken about them before, mostly involving the fact that what about if the game's developer no longer supports the dedicated servers? In other words, they're no longer willing to cough up the cash. Quite simply put, they'll have binary copies of their servers available on Azure, and then what will basically happen is that, I'm talking of course of Titanfall, and then what will basically happen is that your game, let's say that you need to play online with a group of friends, you search for a game, you want to set up a game, it will basically create a server instance if there's not one already available, so it will literally set up the virtual machine in your particular region. And there are a couple of advantages to this, most obviously latency. It's no longer a case where you are going to have host advantage, or whomever is hosting it is going to have host advantage. It's also going to be that, let's assume that you have a crappy internet connection, or the person you're playing with, their host has a crappy internet connection. Let's say they start to download whatever, or start streaming on Netflix while someone else watches something on YouTube, and they've got a crappy internet connection, so suddenly your game goes to hell and back. Also, of course, similar issues such as, say, the host drops out. On a lot of games now, you're quite right. If, for example, I was to drop out of a game while I'm hosting it, what may happen is that one of the other players in the game would automatically be selected based usually on criteria such as, say, their connection quality. They would automatically become the server. So let's assume that I drop out, you've got the next best connection, or you have the best connection available from the other players, then it would be your Xbox or PlayStation or whatever that is now hosting the title. The problem with that is it's not seamless. Let's say that my console just crashes, or I get a power cut. Obviously, my game just goes instantly. It's not like there's a grace period where I'm starting to exit. No, I just crash, and so my connection goes, and then therefore you as a player are just waiting, basically in cyberspace for a few moments while someone else's server, of course, picks up the slack, and that's not seamless process. Other times you can just completely lose connection. It's not seamless, it's not ideal. The benefit of dedicated, of course, is this is no longer going to be the case. There's another plus as well. It actually reduces CPU overhead, and that can be really big. We've spoken heavily about GPU overhead in recent videos, but you've got to remember that CPU overhead is still a big thing as well. And there are not finite resources on next generation consoles, or any console. CPU overhead is going to become increasingly important as we progress towards the end of this generation. 2, 3, 4 years time, obviously, the actual limits of this generation will become a lot clearer. In other words, we'll start realizing if there's any inherent weaknesses in the system, what things Sony, for example, or Microsoft could have done differently to improve the systems, and much more besides. In other words, architectural weaknesses are going to become much more self-evident than what they are now. So, things such as dedicated servers, which will reduce the CPU overhead, are definitely going to become quite nice. We've even spoken previously about how the new audio processors, for example, in the next generation Xbox, free up a lot of CPU compute time. Some Xbox Xbox 360 titles, believe it or not, could actually be using one whole core or one whole thread of their CPU purely on audio processing. And when you consider it, that's a hell of a lot of processing power just used up. So definitely audio being offloaded to dedicated chips, as well as, for example, virtual machines and a lot more besides, are going to become very key. With all of that said, I still have reservations of cloud-based technology. Obviously, some physics are still going to have to be done locally. That's just a given, and I don't think many people are going to be too happy until we have really fast lagless connections, and that's not going to be the case for a long ass time. Obviously, as well, that means that we're going to have some client-side prediction, as well as some server-side prediction as well. In other words, it's going to have to basically guess some of the stuff you're going to be doing based upon what your actions are. This is very similar to what goes in on, say, fighting games, where, quite literally speaking, the game kind of predicts what you're doing. And sometimes it guesses wrongly, other times it guesses rightly, and it becomes a lot better now than what it used to be, but you can really start noticing it, particularly on some laggy titles or some laggy games. For example, let's say you're playing Street Fighter 4 on a laggy connection, not super laggy, but a little bit off. You can start noticing it if you start doing some plinking or some really complicated combos. I say complicated, but not particularly difficult, but whatever. So, simple stuff, you can start noticing that some really basic links can start going really off, simply because latency is an issue. And obviously that doesn't exactly translate to physics, but still, it's just an example. It is, however, going to provide much more consistent and much more complete game worlds. I do have issues, however, of course, that titles are going to rely very heavily on cloud-based technology, and there are some issues with that, as after all, if your internet connection goes down, if the game does have certain features that, for example, the server goes down, Xbox Live goes down, whatever happens, then it could be rendered inert. I suppose, however, one could argue that, let's assume that your internet connection goes down on a title like World of Warcraft, it's pretty much exactly the same thing. Or even if you're playing something like Call of Duty Online, if your internet connection goes down, you're screwed anyway. However, at least I suppose you've got the option to at least play single player, but it's not exactly ideal. I think a lot of the problems that people have right now in the general gist of the public, I'm not talking about necessarily viewers for this channel, I'm not talking about necessarily the media, but I'm talking about the average person. They don't really understand what cloud technology is. And this can go one of two ways. One, it could sound really magical. Even the phrase cloud, it sounds like this mystical fantasy land of, unlimited potential. On the other hand, it's also really easy to write it off as well. And neither one is particularly true. Neither one is particularly accurate. And to consider one or the other is actually doing it a disservice, despite the fact that I heavily critiqued the cloud in the first video. I did go into it with a lot of the negatives, and I still stand by a lot of them. I do. I have issues with things such as, latency. I have issues with the fact that developers just may not continue to support the game after a couple of years. And by the way, we are not really just focusing on Xbox here. Although Xbox is easy to pick on, and I use massive quotes here because obviously it is the company that's mostly focused upon it, you can easily start talking about this for PC gaming and much more besides as well. I just use Xbox because it's more heavily known in the media and by many people to be utilizing the cloud technology. However, it can be, by all means, any developer. And this is something that I've been saying for a while. For example, even Adobe, who of course are responsible for putting out applications such as, say, Adobe Premiere, Photoshop, even Flash now, and a lot more besides, they are offering CC or Creative Cloud, and the basic premise behind that is that you download the application, you install it on your machine, for example Photoshop. Let's say for example you have a Photoshop subscription, you rent it basically. You basically have a license to run that copy, and every 30 days it will say, well, you know what, you need to phone home. In other words, it needs to reactivate the license to ensure that you have permission still to continue utilizing that program. I actually don't really like that model for a couple of reasons. One, I don't really like subscription models that much. I prefer generally to pay things outright. But also, of course, it does have some issues. For example, if you're going traveling or whatever, and you need to say, I don't know, do some editing or whatever on the fly, and you don't really have reliable internet connections. But that's beside the point. One thing I do like about it, however, is at least you do get that grace period. At least you can, operate 2, 3, 4 days without it. And I think that's one of the big problems that a lot of people had with the original DRM of the Xbox One, as, let's face it, people do associate negatively cloud and DRM, and that's not really fair, but that's the problem. People are slowly starting to disassociate the two, but for a while there was a lot of the Xbox One cloud don't like it, DRM, and it was a whole thing. Little did people know that, of course, digital means DRM anyway, and that's the problem. Obviously that, if you buy a copy of a game on the PlayStation 3, for example, let's say I was to buy Infamous 2, just for example, as a disc-based title, well then I'm absolutely fine, I'm absolutely dandy to do whatever the hell I want with it. I can crush it, I can burn it, I can sell it, I can give it to my friend, I can stomp on it, I can keep it forever. It's completely up to me, it is my disc. On the other hand, if I buy a digital copy of it, like it or not, I'm screwed. There's not much I can do. Sure, I can technically give it to my friend. You can put it on a couple of systems, for example, because of Sony's pretty generous system. I heard they were changing that a little bit, but I'm not really certain exactly how. But regardless, still, the point being that you automatically give up some of your freedoms. You cannot sell that afterwards. You can't give it to your buddy for $20, whatever. You can't sell it in a store. It's basically yours forever and ever and ever. It is tied to your account. And this is somewhat of a negative, because if you consider that, for example, the developers behind, say, Call of Duty or a big blockbuster franchise, they don't necessarily want you to give up your copy of the game for your friend to have it, because obviously they don't want you to be selling the copy for cheap and for them to lose money on it, but we all know about that anyway. I think the issue with the cloud is that it's still really early in the dawns of technology. It still is. There's still a hell of a lot more besides. I mean, I remember when people were first initially starting to play online on the console. I'm talking about the original Xbox here. Not the Xbox 360, but really early on the Xbox One, as I used to call it. And the original Xbox, there was some talk about, consoles, PC is where it's at for online gaming. Consoles, not really. Consoles are what I invite friends around to play on games with. And to be honest with you, when I was playing on the PlayStation 2 and the original PlayStation and Saturn and other games and other consoles besides, that was pretty much my mindset, because it wasn't normal for me to do so. It wasn't normal for me to worry isn't really the word, but whatever, to think about playing online on my console. Of course, there had been the Dreamcast and other systems before, but the original Xbox, was what really sold the online experience. They really hammered it home. And despite the fact that people had run up really high phone bills, of course, with titles like Phantasy Star Online on the Dreamcast, it was not really what we were looking for at the time. And so, it was really hit and miss, but then people really started to get into the Xbox, and they started to realise, well, it's not just a case of, inviting your friends around to play Street Fighter or Tekken or, a wrestling game or whatever the hell you want to play. Sometimes it's just more convenient to be at your own respective houses. And this is particularly true if, say, one of you is, 50 miles, 70 miles, 100 miles away from the other person. Sure, you could drive down there, catch a train, whatever you do, but it's not really feasible to do that on a dime. Let's say it's 9:30 in the evening, you've got work the next day, and then you say to yourself, you know what, I really want to play with my buddy Mark, so I'm gonna just drive down 100 miles to his house. It doesn't really work, particularly if, as I said, it's a Sunday evening. So no, it's better just to text him and say, oh, come on the Xbox or come on PlayStation for half an hour, I've got a little bit of time to kill. And then that's cool. So what I'm basically saying to you guys is that a lot of the cloud-based technology is really still early in development. And we are going to be seeing it grow, and that's just how it is. There are going to be a lot of issues with it right now. As I said, I've been fairly vocal with them. I don't really like physics on the system. I don't really like graphics rendering on it particularly. I think some stuff can be done in the background. I think things you don't directly interact with and so on, it could work extremely well with. I think it could create really persistent worlds, but I do have certain worries that I've been really vocal about. Latency, the fact that obviously those servers are not free, so how long can games developers run them for, and much more besides. This is going to be something that we as an industry, and I don't just mean the developers here, that's the thing, it's also you guys, it's me, it's you, it's everyone who buys the games, plays the games. We are gonna be who kind of sets the precedent, because a lot of this stuff is still really early. We're in like a really new media. We're in like this age where things change really fast. I challenge you, I honestly challenge you to look at graphics 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and then look where we are now. It's insane. We're in an age where computers move so quickly that it's scary. Every 12 to 18 months on the PC we have a GPU, for example, which quite literally outperforms the previous one, in some cases by 2 times or more. In some instances we can actually go huge jumps in technology. From, for example, the previous shader architectures, from the GPUs to the unified shader architectures we have today, which are capable of not just processing things such as textures, but then we had things where it was able to process, say, triangle and lighting. And now we've got instances where it's able to actually process physics and everything else that you can imagine. And all of this is starting to become the norm. And so my point being that cloud-based technology is still really early in development. Internet connections are going to be getting faster as well. But it's not right now the point where any of us really want it to be. It's not going to be there for a while. But on the same time, we do start having to embrace new technologies. And to be honest, my own personal point of view, I don't like some aspects of the cloud technology. I don't want to basically be holding a joypad in my hand that's connected to a really long wire to a server farm somewhere. I just don't. I like the idea of holding my own console in my own home, and that's it. For example, what happens if there's a zombie apocalypse as well and the data centers get overrun? I want to be, holed up in my own home with a little generator providing the power so that I can play on my console, damn it. I mean, come on. We have to start talking about the important things here. The zombie apocalypse, people. Zombie apocalypse. People aren't really thinking of that. But on a serious note, there are so many different changes, and a lot of the time developers are starting to try and play catch up with this stuff. And I think for much more persistent game worlds in terms of AI technology, it's not realistic, it's not feasible in 5-6 years time to start to produce the graphics that we're at in terms of realism, in terms of one console, because you know what, we're not even at a percentage, a real decent percentage, not like we're at like 10% of the power required to render real world. We're just not. It's like systems start struggling now, and consoles are going to be the same when graphics start to really ramp up. They're going to start struggling when we start really trying to ramp up 60 frames a second with 1080p, because it's not like you're just saying, okay, well, it's another 5%, 10% extra performance increase to render it. No, it's not. It's a hell of a lot more. And And so there are going to be compromises that are going to be made. I think that it's pretty much impossible to know where the future is going to go. Everyone makes predictions. One of the predictions, of course, is that I believe it was John Carmack who said, well, this is probably going to be the last console generation as is. So in other words, we're not really going to be seeing the PlayStation 5 and Xbox One how it is right now. With a dedicated unit, it's probably going to be a lot more cloud-based than what it is at the moment. Other analysts have said it's not going to be the case. We're going to be seeing at least one more hardware-based generation. And then, who knows, is going to be shifting to the cloud. My point being that frame rate, performance, physics, and everything else are the key, and developers want to see just what is really going to be happening. So, my end thoughts, just to summarize this, because it's getting fairly lengthy as is. I think that we are in the point now where we're going to be seeing a hell of a lot of changes for the Xbox, the PlayStation, and games technology. I think we will start to embrace more and more the idea of cloud-based technologies. Right now it's really early, and it's going to be very interesting to see just how things work. Everyone has their own predictions, and I personally believe, well, I've said what I believe, I'm not going to reiterate it for the dozenth time, but I think that there are some things that are going to work really well on the cloud, some things that aren't going to work really well on the cloud, and I think we're going to find a hell of a lot more stuff besides. Anyway, with that said, hopefully you've enjoyed this series. As I said, this one's not been too technical, just my final thoughts and opinions. But anyway, I will see you soon, hopefully. Take care. Bye for now.